Hello, good people. I'd like to apologize to all my YouTube followers for the fact that I disappeared for several months. I'm still not entirely ready to talk about this, but you deserve a little bit of an explanation. Around this time last year, my mother passed away. We were fairly close. So I've been going through some adjustments and finding my feet again. I tried to struggle through and provide content, but I just couldn't keep it up. So, not only do I feel like I can start doing this again, but some other pressing stuff has been happening that really makes me want to do this episode in particular. For those of you who have been following along on Twitter, you'll know something about some controversy involving English banks taking the initiative of plunging the so-called capitalist West headfirst into a socialist dystopia by cancelling the bank accounts of political dissidents. Sounds like to me it's high time someone with a philosophical mindset reminded those who are supposed to be capitalists how to do their jobs properly. So here it is. We're going to talk about capitalism, how it works, how it came to be, and why it's important to protect. I want to take some artistic license with the intro this time. It's going to be a little somber, reflecting not just the dark times I've been through, but also our civilization, and with it a promise for us to come out the other side enlightened. Let's get into the episode. Now, to give us a little bit of a head start, Google's definition is an economic and political system in which a country's trade and industry is controlled by private owners for profit. This is arguably satisfactory for those who just want a basic definition with no explanation of what that means as a philosophy or method of application. However, I will start by giving my own personal definition of capitalism and explain the reasoning behind it as we go. Capitalism is a method of operating an economy via the means of trading a thing of common value in exchange for a thing of higher personal value or labor. This necessarily is established to an individual's right to own property and an identity, these rights of which are to be held sacred and shall not be infringed. Now, I know I've taken some philosophical license to establish not only that as my definition of capitalism, but also my ideal principle of how it should be maintained and respected. Yeah? Agreed? Our individual right to property, private property and identity should be held sacred and should not be infringed. That especially includes a bank account. I don't want to hear any of this, they're a private company nonsense. Okay, no. Banks are an entity our entire society and government depends on to have a functional economy. They are to be politically neutral. And like I said on Twitter here, their primary concern should be protecting your money, and they shouldn't care what you do or say in your life as long as your money is legitimate. It's why they exist. It's what we pay them for. They are literally central to what is a real economic machine. A machine does not have political opinions. You function as you were meant to. Now, to get back onto the topic, of my justification for the definition of capitalism I've provided. We'll have to delve into a little bit of its history. This system of economy has been in development for thousands of years. It has always relied on someone owning private property to exchange something of common value for either something of personal value or a person's labour. I refer to it as a medium of exchange, but some people will instead refer to it as a debt system. I want to cancel out any arguments over what it is now and say it's both. Yes, you give a person a thing of value to them, and now they owe you something in return. However, we have as a society agreed that thing in return is an item of common value, that which can be reused to meet one's own personal needs. We preemptively agree to the rules of an exchange. Let's use money as the example. This is a thing of common value, being that just about everybody wants it, but they're all willing to trade it for something of higher personal value. This can be food, water, shelter, a luxury, or an investment. In this way, what is of common value and what is of personal value can be interchangeable. This is the essence of starting up a business. If you open up a restaurant, for example, you are trading food as your thing of common value in exchange for something of personal value, which is money. Then you trade that money for other things of higher personal value, both for your business and your life. So you see, this is the cycle of how this machine works. And you might notice it fundamentally works through cooperative self-interest. Remember that. Now, this history of capitalism I'm referring to is when it was more commonly practiced as a debt system. This was before we had such a thing as a cash flow in and out of mass open markets for trade, investments, and civil rights. It's been surmised that ancient tribes had debt systems practiced when an individual did something wrong by another. They would then owe the aggrieved party compensation, usually a form of labour. We eventually had bartering systems where you traded goods or services for goods or services. This was far from equal or reliable, but it was common practice until minted coins came about around 650 BC. Even then, there weren't that many coins to go around, so there were common mixtures of bartering and coinage in circulation. I even came across a reference to a medieval practice of tally sticks, where a piece of wood was marked with notches and ink, broken into a specific size to indicate how much it's worth, and given as evidence of a transaction. These are examples of capitalism in its infancy, before we figured out a way to turn it into a fair medium of exchange that could benefit any individual rather than just those with authority. This was the essence of the feudal system. It was capitalism for the monarchy, but not for the peasantry. Payment in the form of coinage was more commonly shared among the nobility, whereas the peasantry usually bartered with what surplus produce they had. They usually had to get meat from somewhere, but occasionally they could sell surplus for coins that could be spent on some luxuries. That's not to say the feudal system was particularly bad, they just did the best with what they had at the time. The monarchs, lords, and barons had the responsibility of what most businesses nowadays have, but instead they commanded what was needed and when. For the most part, they did a good job. It was only a few monarchs that we got all upset with that we felt the need to start a revolution. This is because societies were still relatively tribal in the respect that a tribe's people were not entirely self-sufficient. They relied on each other for a lot of things. In a medieval kingdom, theories of infrastructure were still in development, and things took a long time to build. Trade routes were long or slow, and few between, subject to risks from climate and a lack of diplomatic connections. The people then just didn't have the ease of commerce we have today. They relied on lords and the sovereign to be competent in their delivery of goods and maintaining awareness of what was needed. Unlike today, where our leaders can screw up over and over again, and the rest of us just keep the ship afloat because of our capitalist structure of high productivity. But after the feudal system came about mercantilism, a new form of economics that was one step closer to what we have today. However, mercantilism is criticized as being a little protectionist in its nature. as there was a purposeful effort to acquire through trade more goods than what was exported. The goal was to always have high reserves of gold and silver. But this was an important step towards contemporary free market capitalism for two reasons. One, it greatly expanded the use of money to the public, from coinage to eventually widely using paper notes. Even though paper notes were used in ancient China, during European mercantilism, printed money was used to keep up with the demand of gold and silver trade. The second important development was double-entry bookkeeping. Even though the practice was adopted as early as the 14th century in Italy, mercantilism relied heavily on this for its mass trade routes and business transactions. All this financial and technological innovation and trade led to the Industrial Revolution, and then things started getting interesting. We made advanced machines that significantly made labor easier. Machines that once constructed need only to be maintained, and you can free people up to complete other tasks. This is where those of you who have read Adam Smith will know about specialization, where we no longer relied on one person to make a whole thing, which was time-consuming and could only cater to so many customers. Now we could have individuals in specialized roles to make one part of a thing and use factory lines to put the product together and produce mass quantities for sale in what was now a free market. For future reference, I've only glossed over the work of Adam Smith. I don't generally read up on the works of other philosophical figures. I've got two reasons for this. First, I like to learn things for myself, and I think anything in the realm of philosophy can be learned on one's own. It just requires logic. Second, I am trying to practice a part of the scientific method of repeatability, that if an original hypothesis is correct, the results should be repeatable by someone else who tried to accomplish the same thing. So if I'm able to come up with similar conclusions to philosophers past on my own merits, then we have further evidence that these propositions are correct, or likely correct. Now, what we have with capitalism is an economic machine for fair exchange and production of goods, currency, and/or labor, with due respect given to a right to own property. I can't stress this enough. Private property is the cornerstone of capitalism. What you own, what's in your name, be it of common value or like money, or personal value like a house or food, is yours to maintain and dispose, no one else's. I think we can understand this instinctually, which is why thievery has always been a severe crime since time immemorial. This is fundamentally how an economy just works best, which is why capitalism is practiced just about everywhere a human civilization exists. Yes, even in the worst socialist dictatorships, they rely on a form of capitalism for the function of their society. It's just heavily politicized or privatized through government mandates in what were supposed to be free market corporations. This annoyingly is the reason why some not so bright socialists like to say socialism or communism has never been tried, or they say it wasn't real socialism. It's because these types of socialists have no idea what they're talking about. Literally. They think capitalism is these big corporations and rich people being greedy and conspiring against the workers. Most don't know the dynamics of the machine they're criticizing, and so don't understand that in order for their socialist goals to be implemented, requires using the machine they despise and actually maintaining it as it currently functions. Or else your civilization will collapse. The more savvy socialists know this, which is why when they get into power, they don't try to destroy the system, they repurpose it to their ideological view of what they think we need and how we should live. Their ideological worldview is not compatible with the human needs of self-reliance, and requires a strict degree of control over the markets and individuals' rights. This inevitably leads to conflicts where sooner or later martial law, genocide, famine, or even civil unrest occurs. And yes, the socialist dictator will persecute their own political team to root out and suppress dissent. They think their way is the right way, and everyone else who disagrees is a bad person, stopping them from achieving their noble work, that they surely cannot possibly be wrong or mistaken. This is why a society also needs freedom of speech. We can't know what we've got right if we do not want to know what we've got wrong, and instead go around punishing anyone who tries to tell us otherwise. Now that I've treaded into this territory, I have to give a rundown on socialism. It's also important because as a movement, it has declared itself the enemy of capitalism. And wherever you try to run an economy, there's always going to be an ideologue wanting to change things to their specific views. So it's only fair. As a capitalist, I get to call these people out in kind. Socialism is an ideology that started development around the 18th century and 19th centuries. Its basic premise was seeing various forms of personal, especially financial, disparities, and coming to the conclusion this was done purposefully, or at least with callous disregard by those in positions of power. In this way, their obsession with abolishing private property is a misperception in which private ownership is used primarily for profit and not the welfare of the people. This is a misperception because the market is managed by adults, people who live by a standard of self-reliance. What we want from a market is opportunities to acquire for ourselves what we think we need, instead of being given handouts or being made to live by mandates. It's also important to note, some like to say all our publicly funded services are thanks to socialism. Do not fall for this fallacy. Most of the funded services we have today were created and maintained in some form or another thousands of years before the ideology of socialism existed. I've had people tell me that it's thanks to socialism we've got roads. You know, roads, the laying down of stones to form a pathway for travel. First invented and maintained thousands of years ago by various cultures before the French Revolution. Romans, for example, are often credited for building roads for the large number of highways they built for military purposes, but roads go back all the way to ancient Egypt. And before anyone goes there, taxes have also existed for thousands of years. I'm certain all of the social services we have today not only rely on capitalism in order to function, but would have been implemented in some manner even if socialism as an ideology never existed. The reason is because capitalism, as I've described it here, demonstrates a methodology that's evolved over thousands of years. Socialism is an ideology that specifically started development during and after the French Revolution. And don't give me notions of mixed economies. It's either capitalist, that follows my definition, that it produces the wealth to pay for goods or fund services, or it's ideologically state-controlled to socially and financially enforce what's perceived to be the collective good, where what's good for you as an individual is not determined by you, but by the state. Now, realistically, any socialist desires should have been sated as soon as free market capitalism was achieved. People could finally, as individuals, entirely control their financial situation. But this was never the issue. The issue was always perceiving the higher class or the rich as a selfish oppressor of anyone beneath, and using this as an excuse to redistribute other people's wealth to those who have not, and perhaps do not want, to earn it. A common argument you might also hear is that of surplus wealth. Employers taking more from profits of a business than what they give to the worker. Now, as a working class lad, who's worked in many a kitchen, I can tell you, I cannot be paid for the surplus of the product that I produced. When I make so many entrees, mains, and desserts, the money earned from that has to not just pay for my work, but it has to go back into the business to pay for the supplies needed for the next day of work. It's for this reason that the working class have always supported capitalism, rather than revolted against it like Karl Marx tried to predict. Workers want to work. Our primary intention is to earn money from reliable employment because we want to serve our personal interests. This is Career Goals 101. What will make the working class revolt against corporate greed is discriminating and persecuting your workers and customers, denying them the right to work or to buy and sell products to sustain their ability to live their lives on their own terms, or denying them a bank account on political grounds, for example. That is my prediction, because that is the history of previous revolutions. People either being denied or being unable to meet their own needs of their own agency due to government authoritarianism or incompetence. Now, because socialism as an ideology is a little vague, as to who the oppressor is at any given time is up for interpretation. This is where socialism branches off into different ideologies. Karl Marx, probably the most famous socialist, interpreted the oppressor as the bourgeoisie, the middle-class rich employers, and the oppressed as the proletariat, the poor, supposedly disenfranchised workers. It's actually really annoying that he's so well revered, when he was personally a very flawed and at times unclean and abusive individual. Very needy, and like a good communist, used other people's labour and wealth to get by. But the vision of socialism he interpreted led to writing the Communist Manifesto, that literally calls for violent revolution, and this is a quote written in the manifesto. "We have nothing to lose but our chains." I know some of you might have heard that before, and now you know where it comes from. But his vision was not implemented until Vladimir Lenin started his Marxist socialist revolution against the Tsars in Russia. He and Stalin then committed genocide and famine, killing tens of millions of people. Then, not long after, we had German and Italian socialists implement their own versions of how to best run a civilization. These were Nazism and fascism, respectively. Now, everyone should understand Nazi meant National Socialist. This does mean that they were against capitalism. In Hitler's psychotically delusional worldview, he falsely perceived the Jewish people controlled the capitalist machine through their commonly held positions running banks. This is an example of why there's no consistency in who socialists believe is the oppressor. It's not good enough to say it's the rich people. It's always who are they specifically, and this can involve their race or their gender. More on that later. Fascism is a little bit more complicated. It was coined and written by Giovanni Gentile, a socialist who claimed fascism is socialism's most workable form, concluding that what was in the state's interests was the same as the public's interests. This is what he called true democracy, of people submitting to the state, which really is still no different to his communist and socialist cousins in Russia and Germany. Even they had what I can call ideologically state-controlled capitalism. Gentile's views were implemented by the socialist Benito Mussolini. To cut a long story short, he was a member of the Italian Socialist Party, he had disagreements with how it's best practiced, and then started his own movement. Contemporary socialists denounce Nazism and fascism as not real socialism, very likely because they got conned into believing the benevolence of socialism before they learned anything about the atrocities it's committed. Communism's horrors are greater in number, but are spread out over stumbling civil wars, purges, and famines. Nazism, however, has the reputation of being probably the most highly organized, systematic attempted mass killing of an entire race of people, which is much more horrifying in scope. So, of course, when confronted with these horrors, they say, not real socialism. Also, just because there were bloody disagreements between fascists and communists as to how to best implement their socialist governments, sympathizers like to use these differences to obfuscate the origins of Nazism and fascism as different to their own ideals. But you can't escape that both camps opposed free market capitalism and wanted state-controlled means of production and wealth distribution, and this meant extreme measures against dissidents. It's also important to note that the word fascist is derived from Italian and Latin. From Italian, fascio, to mean group or union, and from Latin fasces to mean a bundle of sticks. That's especially important so you can understand why the fascism symbol, see here, is a bundle of sticks. I bet some puzzling pieces you might not have understood for a while are finally starting to click together now, aren't they? It's finally all making sense. It's for this reason I won't be surprised if this video gets banned. Too many truth bombs with supportive logic in one hit. We'll see. Now finally, the F-bomb. Feminism. Its origins also lay in socialism, with the likes of socialist thinkers like Charles Fourier, who coined the term, and what contemporary feminists like to attribute to Mary Wollstonecraft for her writings on the vindication of women's rights. Apparently her writings spoke of class and private property were the basis of discrimination against women. Now, I'm sorry ladies, but in those days, ease of access to information wasn't so simple. It was the men who had most of this access because they were expected, just as they still are today, to be the protectors and providers. From what I have read of these early feminists, they just made unsubstantiated, and yes, emotional claims of oppression. They didn't base their arguments with research that was actually backed up with logic. They used emotional language to pull at the heartstrings and get people to react. These women were also often middle class or upper class, but miseducated in not understanding or appreciating the duty their fellow men had, and assumed the political actions those men took were callous with disregard. They weren't. Men have always tried to do right by you. Why do you think it's so easy to manipulate men to do whatever you want? This is not new. It's soft-wired from evolution. The reason why you might be having trouble with men these days is because we're figuring this out and we're putting up a little bit of resistance of our own. But I digress. We can see the earliest feminists had the same complaints as any other socialist. However, when they looked at who the so-called oppressive rich people were, they noticed all the rich people were men. Then later devised a whole conjecture of oppression they call patriarchy theory of oppression. It is entirely conjecture. They cast aspersions on the motives of men, both past and present, and it's only in recent decades that people have done much of anything to defend men from feminism's scathing charges of felony oppression against their own beloved mothers, wives, sisters, and daughters. How does that make sense? All of these forms of socialism have a misinterpretation of what capitalism is and how it works with human nature, being our instinct to survive and reproduce. They usually come to the conclusion that it's conspiratorial, whereas the history I've talked about now and the definition I've come to show it's evolutional. Evolutional from a debt system to barter systems to feudalism to mercantilism and then what we call free market capitalism. It's also evolutional when it comes to the conjecture of patriarchy. We are currently a patriarchal and gynocentric species. This simply means the men are in charge of protection and provision for women in the effort to keep the species alive. This, by extension, means men typically have overt power to physically make things move in the world, whereas women have covert power over the actions and driving incentives of men. This is the typical dynamic we function under, as women are the limiting factor in reproduction. It's critical they are protected and provided for, or else a tribe or even the species itself is at risk of extinction. However, we are an adaptive species, and this dynamic can change under the right environmental pressures. Say, for example, if some sickness wiped out 90% of the men, it's highly likely we'd become matriarchal and androcentric instead. Women, yes, would be probably in charge of a lot of things, that being they'd have most of the responsibilities men currently have, but would dedicate their efforts instead to keeping men alive, happy and comfortable, like we currently do for women. because with so few of them, you'd be at risk of extinction. This is why I can say the feminist Sally Miller Gerhardt, who's famous for wanting the patriarchy smashed so badly, she stated the male population needs to be reduced to about 10%. Reduced and maintained, I think she said. I could say this was a statement that was really lacking in forethought. And that's without asking exactly who it is that was going to keep the lights on after the men were all dead. So the nature of how we've developed and maintained capitalism is an evolutionary dynamic, which was heavily influenced by environmental, biological, and technological conditions. No one person or group is directly in charge of it. We all influence it through our work, what we buy, what we sell, and what we innovate and invest in. It operates best when anybody willing is able to participate and contribute to the overall production, wealth, and intellectual developments of civilization. To participate in this system requires we all have the right to use our autonomy, to pursue our own interests, to earn money, and acquire and maintain private property in our own name. As long as no one is physically hurting anybody or committing crimes, one should be left to their own devices, even if you don't like the way they do things. And yes, capitalism relies on self-interest, because everything we do is through self-interest. This can't be avoided. I give a pretty good explanation. I'll put it in the link below, in the description below, where I talk about the nature of selfishness. Now, a company's incentive to provide a service and maintain a good reputation is the reward they get for serving the self-interests of individuals interested in that service. I'll say that again. The individuals interested in that service, meaning you don't discriminate against any of them, or else you damage your reputation and then other people won't pay for what you have to offer. They'll just take their business elsewhere where they'll be treated with some respect. Now, I was going to include a little talk on the finer workings of capitalism and how inflation is caused, and why you can't just go around printing money to solve everything. I know I've talked for long enough, but I reckon I can condense this down to a few short sentences. Inflation is a financial report showing how prices have raised over time. It is only understood to have happened after the fact and is not something that is just switched on or off. People say it's when supply can't meet demand, or too much money chasing too few goods. What this means is if people are spending more money to buy more of a product, and the producer is now struggling to meet demand, they have to expend more costs to either source more of their product or hire more workers. These greater costs are covered by raising prices of goods. There is your inflation, or at least one way it happens. Another way is if a government increases taxes or spending of taxes or imposes sanctions. If this affects companies, they might raise their prices to cover costs. And it can also happen with wage increases. If a company gave all of its employees a $10 raise, the money to pay for that increased wage is going to come from what they sell to the public. You can imagine this would send product prices for that company through the roof. You might also be understanding now why you can't just have a high-paying minimum wage that provides a living. Product prices would just increase and the cost of living would disrupt the economy, forcing other wages and prices to also change, ultimately settling on the original disparity that was originally addressed by raising the minimum wage. And again, if you just print money, which is not really how that works, but if you did that, the spending exceeds the supply of goods, which causes pressure to raise prices to compensate for the extra costs of meeting demand, and causes inflation. Do this too much for too long, and you'll have a situation where hundreds to thousands of dollars are needed just to buy basic things. I'm sorry, but we've just got to work our way up in life. Or find a suitor who's happy to provide for you in exchange for the help and kindness you give in return. And that's totally okay, whether you're a man or a woman. Couples and families work to keep each other happy and healthy. It's how we've survived for so long. Capitalism always wins, and patriarchy is just a state of nature. We can understand it, refine our ability to operate within it, but you can't control it. Alright. This has been fun, but I've gone on long enough. And I've given you a lot to think about. Key takeaway I want for you guys is the principle I've surmised. Capitalism is a method of operating an economy via the means of trading a thing of common value in exchange for a thing of higher personal value or labor. This necessarily is established to an individual's right to own property and an identity, these rights of which are to be held sacred and shall not be infringed. Yes, capitalists, or so-called capitalists, our banks and corporations, all of you are cogs in a machine. Leave your political opinions at the door and accommodate your customers. This is what we should hold ourselves to. This is how capitalism works best for everyone and should work for everyone, even the people you don't like or agree with. Alright, that's it. I'm done. I'm done for this episode. Don't collapse civilization before my next video, please. Alright. I hope you all have a good evening or a good morning, wherever you are. And see you later.